This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by University of California Press, publishers of the book The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State by Amaya Gelman. A gripping and incisive read, this first ever history of the Anti-Defamation League shows that it was never the steadfast defender of civil rights that it claimed to be. Tracing the ADL's conflicts with social justice movements, this book reveals the organization's long-standing partnership with U.S. empire. Learn more about the Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State at UCPress.edu. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. This is the third episode of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Nusantara is a word that refers to the vast geographic archipelago that only through centuries of colonial capitalism and the struggles against it became a nation. One whose boundaries, identities, and purpose remain contested to this day. These introductions are rather lengthy, but I suggest that you listen to them. They will help orient you as we move through a complex historical discussion. The Japanese military was initially greeted as a liberatory force when it occupied the Dutch East Indies during World War II. European colonialism was, at least for the meantime, over, and it was over thanks to the industrial and military capacity of a fellow Asian nation. Japan presented its expansionist militarism as a vehicle for Pan-Asianism to make, quote, Asia for Asians. Indonesians' appraisal of their new rulers would soon sour. But the Japanese occupation, which lasted only from March 1942 through Japan's surrender to the Allies in August 1945, it profoundly altered Indonesian society and set the nation on the path to independence. The Japanese soon made clear that they exceeded even the Dutch in brutality. Arrests, torture, executions, forced labor, mass starvation. But the Japanese Empire required labor and resources. Toward that end, they tapped key nationalist leaders like Sukarno and Hatta and mobilized Islamic organizations, all to set the masses into motion. Sukarno's role as the head of Putra, Pusat Tenaga Rakyat, Center of People's Power, was to mobilize the Indonesian masses to support the Japanese war effort. This included collecting rice for the war and sending thousands of Indonesian peasants, often to their death, to do forced labor, Romusha, in the archipelago and other theaters of war across Southeast Asia. This position allowed Sukarno to develop relationships with state bureaucrats and to position himself as a symbolic leader of the republic. Japanese government education and propaganda reached far deeper into Indonesian society than the Dutch colonial government ever had. This, for the first time, swept huge numbers of people into feverish political thought and action. Peasants, whose lives were previously shaped by outside forces only indirectly, were now consciously drawn in to national and global conflicts. The Japanese also mobilized the Islamic traditionalist organization Nahdlatul Ulama, or NU, and the Islamic modernist group Muhammadiyah. In fact, they joined the two into a united organization called Masyumi, or the Indonesian Muslim Consultative Council. Islamic organizations that had once avoided politics were now deeply politicized and have remained so, quite consequentially, through the present. As we discussed in episode 2, the Dutch had created a formal distinction between the political Islam of Stateat Islam and the non-political Islam of the NU or Muhammadiyah. The Japanese occupation abolished that distinction. Anticipating an Allied invasion, the Japanese also decided that they required the people of the East Indies to mobilize as an armed mass, leading to the organization of major militias known as the Pemuda, or Youth, and Pata, or Defenders of the Homeland. Those forces, alongside soldiers professionally trained in the KNIL, or Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, they would wage the revolution against the Dutch and form the TNI, or Indonesian National Armed Forces. Other major anti-colonial figures like Amir Sharafuddin and Shahrir rejected collaboration with the Japanese on anti-fascist grounds. They rejected the approach of Sukarno, Hatta, and others who collaborated with a regime that imposed catastrophic death and misery upon the Indonesian people. That collaboration nonetheless did pay off, putting Sukarno and Hatta in a position to lead the revolution once the Japanese surrendered in 1945. Sukarno and Hatta, under pressure from youth activists who had kidnapped them, they declared independence on August 17, 1945, just 2 days after the Japanese emperor surrendered. But the Dutch had other plans. With the Axis powers defeated, they moved to reassume control over their erstwhile colony. But instead, the Dutch, alongside British and other allied forces, they immediately faced ferocious armed resistance from Indonesians. The Republic established its headquarters in the city of Yogyakarta, one of Java's 4 principalities. They fought the Dutch until 1949. Here are some key events and concepts and personalities to keep in mind when thinking about the revolutie, or revolution. First, as the Japanese began to lose the war, they understood that they needed to woo the masses to their side and created 2 preparatory bodies looking forward to independence. Amidst this work, Sukarno, various nationalists, and Islamic leaders also began to work on Indonesia's constitution. Adopted after the Japanese surrender, it called for a powerful presidency and outlined the Republic's territory as encompassing then British colonies across Malaya and the northern side of Borneo, or Kalimantan. It also marked the first promulgation of the doctrine of Pancasila, 5 principles that would guide both Sukarno's guided democracy and Suharto's New Order reaction against it. Belief in God, nationalism, humanitarianism, social justice, and democracy. Under pressure from Islamic leaders, it was rephrased as belief in one God. The anti-colonial revolution against the Dutch was immediately also a social revolution within Indonesian society. Violent class conflict with a comprador native elite, such as the widespread massacre perpetrated by indentured laborers and peasants in East Sumatra against the regional aristocracy. The armed struggle was accompanied by a diplomatic track whose first conclusion was the November 1946 Linggarjati Agreement that called for the establishment of a federated United States of Indonesia. Various puppet states across the archipelago, with only Java and Sumatra under control of the Republic of Indonesia. And the United States of Indonesia, in turn, would form part of a Dutch-Indonesian union led by the Dutch Queen as head of state. This led to increasingly sharp divisions within the Republic, with the military opposing concessions to the Dutch alongside various radical currents that advocated 100% independence. The Dutch proved the skeptics of negotiations right by launching a bloody invasion of Republican-held territory in July 1947, euphemistically described by the Dutch as the first police action. Indonesians call it the military aggression. Its formal name was Operation Product because it sought, above all else, to capture key economic infrastructure like oil. In January 1948, the Republican Dutch signed another accord, the Renville Agreement, named for the U.S. naval ship where it was signed under U.S. pressure. That agreement was even more tilted toward Dutch colonial power, requiring Republican military forces to retreat into central Java around the revolutionary capital of Yogyakarta. During this period, Sukarno remained president and would remain so until Suharto's coup. Meanwhile, cabinets representing the major currents of Indonesian politics formed and dissolved under different prime ministers. The first government was led by Shahrir, a strong candidate for the role because his anti-fascist refusal to collaborate made him more palatable to the Western Allied powers. Collaborating nationalists like Sukarno were viewed with intense suspicion. Shahriar's government fell because it prioritized diplomacy to achieve independence, resulting in the controversial Linggarjati Agreement. Shahriar's government faced opposition from the left, opposition led by Tan Malaka, who had broken with the PKI to found the Persatuan Perjuangan, or Struggle Union, later the Murba Party, which demanded 100% independence without ceding an inch of Indonesian territory to the Dutch. Next, in July 1947, leftist Amir Sharafuddin became the prime minister, but he quit in January 1948 amid bitter conflicts, once again, over the capitulatory Renville Agreement. Meanwhile, communist leaders like Musso had re-entered the country. Renville heightened conflict between maximalists and negotiators. It also led to the eruption of the Darul Islam Rebellion in West Java. Darul Islam was led by Kartosuwiryo, who, as you might remember, had as a young boy, like nationalist Sukarno and communist Musso, passed through the house of Serikat Islam leader Cokro Aminoto. The Darul Islam Rebellion, a rebellion against Dutch and Republic alike, that rebellion emerged to fill the vacuum left by the Republican Siliwangi Division's evacuation from West Java under the terms of the Renville Agreement. The emergence of the Darul Islam Rebellion was also driven by the Indonesian military's Reconstruction and Rationalization Program, or RIRA, implemented by Hatta and supported by Nasution, commander of the Siliwangi Division. Or as General Suderman, the commander of the armed forces, had an unmatched symbolic, almost mythic quality to his leadership. Nasution was perhaps more powerful in terms of directing actual military organization and operation. RIRA aimed to remove many popular militias from the military organization and, as a result, was opposed by the right-wing militia Hezbollah, which Kartosuwiryo later reorganized into Darul Islam, the Indonesian Islamic Army. RIRA was also opposed by left-wing groups that led the Madiun Rebellion of 1948. In the city of Madiun, PKI-aligned forces with the People's Democratic Front seized control in September 1948. The PKI leadership had not initiated the revolt, but soon joined it, including Amir Sharafuddin, who announced that he was, in fact, a PKI member. Republican forces, led by the relocated Siliwangi Division, quickly put it down, killing many communists, including important leaders like Musso and Amir Sharafuddin, who, again, had until only recently been the prime minister. This marked the second of the PKI's 3 historic defeats. The first, which we discussed last time, was in 1926. The final, one of history's worst mass murders, would take place in 1965. The Republican military forces melded together former soldiers and officers from the colonial KNIL and the Japanese-created Pemuda and PETA militias. But the merger of these disparate forces was not easy. Some former KNIL soldiers, who received professional military training from the Dutch Military Academy in Bandung, they became the architects of the Reconstruction and Rationalization Program, RIRA. That put them into conflict with former PETA soldiers, who had received only brief military training from the Japanese, and with other militias that had received no military training whatsoever from anyone. From the get-go, the military was self-organized and only intermittently deferential to civilian authority. Officers elected Suderman the first commander of the armed forces without asking for Sukarno's permission. The lack of clear civilian oversight of the military would generate frictions and crises throughout Sukarno's presidency, and it would make possible the 1965 coup that ended it. The military would gradually become an increasingly powerful state within the state, until it just took over the entire state. Amid the so-called Madiun affair, the Dutch launched a direct invasion of what remained of Republican territory, a military aggression they euphemistically called their second police action. It forced a Republican retreat from the revolutionary capital at Yogyakarta. This time, however, the Indonesian resistance was assisted by the diplomatic power wielded by the United States, which pushed the Dutch to stop its assault and to negotiate. Not very long ago, the U.S. had helped the Dutch impose the lopsided Renville Agreement. But amid the onset of the Cold War, the Republic's repression of the communists at Madiun made the U.S. see a potential partner in Sukarno, at least for the meantime. Who were these revolutionaries? Benedict Anderson called this a youth revolution. It was a revolution carried forward overwhelmingly by young people in their teens, 20s, and 30s. Sukarno and Hatta were the old guys. It wasn't a socialist proletarian revolution or a liberal middle-class revolution. It's true that the leaders of this revolution did come from the educated middle class, but the activists of the revolution were also Islamic boarding school students, santri, who joined Islamic militias, or rural youth who joined leftist militias. Among those young people was the future dictator Suharto, who joined PETA and, at the time, was somewhat sympathetic to the leftist movement. So, where else can you find a multi-part series on the history of Indonesia that'll leave you with a complex, savvy understanding of the critical role that the world's fourth largest country has played in the history of the colonial capitalist world system and the struggles against it? You listen to The Dig because we are, in so many ways, an unusual podcast. The only way we can do what we do and put it out almost every week with no paywall so that everyone can listen is because listeners like you support us at patreon.com/thedig. We also have swag of all sorts. So please, that's patreon.com/thedig. There's a link in the show notes. Please click it. Speaking of crazy things we spend our time doing for you, we've developed a super comprehensive website to accompany Thawra, our giant series on the 20th century history of the Arab East. It's a really beautiful, rich website full of study guides, lists of books and articles and videos, really so much. It's extraordinary. I'm so proud of it and all the work that so many people who work with The Dig put into it. Check it out at thawraproject.com. There's a link in the show notes. Also, more Dig parties coming. Next, Seattle and LA. The Dig Party in Seattle, Wednesday, May 20th from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. at Stoop Brewing, co-sponsored with How's Our Neighbors. The Dig Party in LA will be May 26th, 6 p.m. onwards at Audiograph Beer Company, co-sponsored with DSALA and the National Day Laborer Organizing Network, or NDLON. Please RSVP. There are links in the show notes. Okay, here's Rianne Subijanto, Mada Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 3 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College in the Graduate Center of the City of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media Indoprogress.com. Mada Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Izias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department at Gadjah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He has worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Let's turn to 1942, when the Imperial Japanese Army's invasion put an end to Dutch colonial rule. It also brought Indonesian nationalists like Sukarno and Hatta into positions of power because the Japanese recruited them to lead propaganda work, mobilize volunteer militias, facilitate mass popular organization. But I don't want to talk about that crucial, complex, controversial subject of nationalist collaboration with the Japanese quite yet. First, how did the Japanese occupation transform the situation in Indonesia? What did the conquest and consolidation of Japanese power look like? How did Japanese rule combine propaganda and consent with coercion to cement its power? And then lastly, what sort of rule was it over these profoundly consequential 3 years of the Japanese occupation? How did Japanese cruelty and exploitativeness compare to the Dutch colonialists? My sense is that ordinary Indonesians initially welcomed Japanese as liberators, but that soon enough, the bitter experience of Japanese brutality and famine, Japanese imposed famine, really changed people's mindset.
Yeah, I think the Japanese occupation changed radically the Dutch East Indies in a matter of 3 years. It's a very short period of time. Japanese introduced so many things that still exist even until now. For example, the concept of tonarigumi, the neighborhood associations. Right now, rukun tetangga, that's what we call it in Indonesia. This has become the form of mobilization and control by the Japanese government. So it has it's a very effective organization because the head of the neighborhood association will report directly to the Japanese military. So the new order revived this and then perpetuate this, and we have it until now. And the second thing, I think I want to reiterate that something is missing from our discussion is about Islamic groups. Japanese creating what they call it Supreme Islamic Council in Indonesia. Some part of a Syarikat Islam is there, the chairman and the people from the Nahdlatul Ulama, Kiai Abdul Wahab Hasbullah was there, and from Muhammadiyah was there. So from so many Islamic organizations, the Japanese put it in one place, in one council, and it becomes a very, very powerful political party later on. It becomes the second largest party. It became Masyumi in Indonesia in 1955, even though after that there's a crack in the Islamic movement. But never before, I think the Islamic political forces are put into one basket and become very big and become very powerful only during the Japanese occupation.
Yeah. So essentially, the Japanese occupation was such a transformative and such an important period, even though it's very short, right? Because essentially, within just a few weeks, the whole world was turned upside down. Just in weeks, the Netherlands East Indies, that it fell and shattered. It actually erupted this illusion that the Dutch colonial government was this stable colonial possession, but actually, in fact, it was not, right? So yes, at first, many Indonesians did welcome the Japanese because they thought that Japan would accelerate independence, right? And also the Japanese used anti-Western, anti-imperialist rhetoric. They freed the nationalist leaders, Sukarno and Hatta, right? So how could the Indonesians did not have a high hope on the Japanese to liberate them? But that quickly, of course, confidence shattered as well because the Japanese essentially, were immediately brutal, leading to death of Indonesians from starvation, disease, and forced labor, right? So they combined propaganda, Asia for Asians, mass rallies, political organizations like Putra, and then mobilization campaigns led by Sukarno, as well as coercion, surveillance, torture. They're very torturous, much more torturous than the Dutch, by the Kempeitai, which is the military police. Also use forced labor or Romusha. Actually, it's only 3 years, but all of us remember what Romusha means, right? We talk about it all the time in schools. And then suppression of dissent and forced rights requisition. So they were much, much more brutal and cruel. One thing, though, that's also very important during the Japanese era is, and this is written by Norman Joshua in his dissertation from Northwestern, and this is important for our discussion of Indonesia throughout to the present, which is this is the period of the beginning where there was the beginning of the militarization of Indonesian society, because because the Japanese rule was a military occupation. Indonesia was divided into separate military zones governed by army commanders, and civil administration was subordinated to military priorities. And there are two people I'm going to mention that would be so important later, who was actually trained militarily during the Japanese occupation, Aidit and Suharto. Right. So these people came out of this. They started their career during this time.
I think very correct that the Japanese period really was so transformative. I think there's a couple of things which I can say about this. So first of all, different from the Dutch colonial period, the Japanese occupation expanded state presence to the local level. So people were actually, for the first time in a lot of cases, meeting the state. During the Dutch colonial period, the state was very far away. It was less imposing in a lot of ways because they didn't really care about, in the little villages and so forth, they cared about how to extract resources or labor. During the Japanese period, this changed because the state sort of went into the nooks and crannies of society. So that's one thing. The second thing is that the Dutch bureaucrats were all put into concentration camps, right? So the entire Dutch population was, and so there's now this massive colonial apparatus of colonial capitalism, colonial bureaucracy, and so forth, which isn't manned. And so a lot of these are then being filled with Indonesians. So they were all coming up into and taking over the railroads, taking over the oil rigs, so there was this accelerated modernization within Indonesian society, in which they took over a lot of the colonial apparatuses, the police, the military, and so forth. So Indonesians were being trained up to speed and then just sort of pushed into these roles, which are at the managerial level or at the other levels. There were Japanese, but there weren't enough of them, so there were a lot more Indonesians in. So as a result of this expansion of traditional Indonesia into the state, right? Traditional Indonesia into all of these new sectors. Traditional Indonesian society, for the first time, I think, met with colonial bureaucrats, Indonesian colonial bureaucrats, and with the Indonesian radicals. So they became office mates, in a sense. They're now working in offices together. And so a very important part in the Japanese period is the creation of post-colonial elite. Because for the first time, they had to work together, and so they had to make a pact, like what kind of elite. Because people in the radical nationalists during the colonial period, they rarely meet anyone from the cleric groups or from the other traditional sectors of society. But now suddenly they're working together in the office. So at the elite level, there's a change in the type of elites, but then also that the elites of Indonesia isn't from one place. It's actually an amalgamation of people from the clerical group, people from the traditional aristocracy, people from the traditional the European bureaucracy, Indonesian bureaucrats, and people from the radical nationalists. So they're now one elite in that sense. They don't always agree together, but it's much more concentrated. At the grassroots level, something even more significant is happening. As I said, because the Japanese incorporated traditional society into the state. This is something that's very fundamentally different from the colonial period. So a lot of the discussions previously, PNE and so forth, this represents a very, very tiny amount of Indonesian people. Less than 1%, probably something like that. And their enemies are, the fascist Europeans, they're also less than, it's just a really tiny part. The vast majority of traditional Indonesia continued on their life as if nothing happened. But during the Japanese occupation, they were all suddenly catapulted into national participation. So this resulted in I think, two things. First of all, the emergence of the pemuda, the youth. So if we think of the youth, during the colonial period, the youth is actually a Western educated European youth. They're not really related to the traditional youth. The traditional youth is not, they're too westernized. Like Sukarno is youth, but what does he know about being in the village, right? He's had a middle class life throughout his life. But suddenly the Japanese forced the youth into another form of, and Benedict Anderson wrote about this, right? About how the Japanese took over Javanese sort of ritual for young people to become adult, the coming of age from traditional institutions like pesantren and so forth, and integrated it into the state. So what you had is that now the Indonesian youth, traditional youth became Indonesian youth. Suddenly you had Indonesians actually, because now people weren't becoming. If you were coming of age in a Javanese village, you become a Javanese. You're part of that traditional society. But suddenly, you're not. Suddenly, you become Indonesian. So in a sense, the Japanese created that lower layer of Indonesian as a citizenship. On another level, the Japanese is so focused on developing practices. A lot of the national practices that we have today stems from the Japanese. So either the Japanese meant or not, either it's an unintended consequences, the Japanese defined Indonesia's performativity as a nation, right? Performativity as a citizen through the flag ceremony, through all of these stuff, which didn't really exist during the colonial period. Now the Japanese introduced them, and now it's become like the central tenet to educate young people to become Indonesian as a. So that's why at so many levels, the Japanese sort of changed society radically at a fundamental level. And that's why the Dutch was so confused when they came back to Indonesia after the war, because they couldn't understand the Indonesian people now. It's radically different because they thought the Javanese were these rural people who were very happy and they were very traditional and they had all these adat and they don't. And then when they came back in 46, you had these crazy pemuda, and they do what kind of thing? What did the Japanese do to the Indonesians? So, but they couldn't understand what was happening. I think fundamentally, the Dutch didn't understand what was happening.
Yeah.
Three things to add about Japanese brutality before we move on, just to emphasize. One, that many women were raped and forced into prostitution. Second, that they were quite brutal not only to ordinary Indonesians but to Dutch and Indos. When it came to Dutch troops, they would often not take prisoners. They would just massacre everyone, shooting, beheading, etc. And then finally, the famine and forced labor imposed upon Indonesians was just truly extreme. I just want to, because there are texts that people can read to get the texture of this, and we're talking at higher levels of historical abstraction here. But I just want to convey to listeners the level of the violence and suffering. Let's turn to the subject of collaboration. Why did the Japanese decide to recruit nationalist and Islamist leaders into collaborating with their regime, the very sorts of people that the Dutch colonialists were so actively repressing? After all, as we've been discussing, it's not because the Japanese were a less repressive system than the Dutch. So why did they recruit these people? And then why did nationalist leaders like Sukarno and Hatta, why did they decide to collaborate with the Japanese regime that was intent on making the archipelago part of its so-called Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere? And then lastly, why was it that other nationalist leaders like Shahrir and Amir Sharifuddin, that they refused cooperation with the Japanese very emphatically?
Yeah, I think the short answer is that because these people, these nationalists, were repressed by the Dutch, and a lot of them being put in exile. And then after the Japanese came in, they need somebody or people who can organize the mass society. The occupation was brutal. It was very brutal. I think famine everywhere, and then it not only they killed not only the Dutch or put in jail only the Dutch, but also the people, the Chinese, for example, because they have a history with Chinese, and it's a very hard time for the Chinese at that time. And then suddenly, and also if I remember the oral history, how the people have a memory about this time. At first, people are very happy with the Japanese because for a long time we are the colonized, and we are being degraded. It's not we are not human beings. And then suddenly you see, I think I still remember part of the movie from Raiding the Tiger. The late Father Mangun Wijaya told the story about what on earth these small people, smaller than us, line up and then parading in our cities and towns. And they can destroy all of the big Dutch people very easily. And yeah, that kind of thing, it creates a pride among the people in this area before. But at the same time, also later on, after they found out that the Japanese required them to do this and that and this and that, and then suddenly food become very scarce, and then famine everywhere. People also have no choices except cooperate with the Japanese. But for the nationalists, I think they know the opportunities. This is their chance to get into the system, to build something probably that when the Japanese left, they will inherit this. There will be no Dutch anymore. So there will be independence in Indonesia. And the Japanese knows this very well also. So they give the chance for these people, for these nationalists, to build their own state. And then that's what happened. After 3 years, and then the Japanese pave a way, set up a committee, and then let the Indonesian decide what was to do after they surrendered.
In some ways, I think Hatta and Sukarno were gambling, right? Because they thought they knew that there is this global war and it is reshaping empires everywhere. And obviously, they also knew immediately in practice the Japanese controlled the archipelago with military arms. And so it's not possible to do open resistance unless you would receive immediate execution, right? That's not possible. So let's just collaborate. But I want to address your question on why did Shahrir and especially Shahrir and Amir refuse? Because they refused to collaborate with the Japanese. They had a different view. For Shahrir, because he's anti-fascist, he's deeply anti-fascist, he saw Japan not as an Asian Asian collaborator, right? Or an Asian liberator, but as a militarist empire that is aligned with the Nazi Germany. So for him, if we collaborate with the Japanese, we would be morally compromised, right? And we would morally compromise the legitimacy of Indonesian independence. And so Shahrir actually believed that our independence would depend, in fact, on the Allied victory. And so if the Allied won, and they knew that Indonesian leaders had been collaborating with the Japanese, that would not be good for the Indonesian independence itself. And this is actually true because after the declaration of independence, a few months later, Shahrir became prime minister because he was not tainted by the collaboration with the Japanese.
So why did the Japanese include the radical nationalists and the clerics, right? I think primarily because they needed to mobilize labor. Their primary objective is to mobilize both resource and labor. And I think their frame of thinking is that mass appeal and traditional leaders had to be included to mobilize these kind of things. So especially in Java, the main idea was how do you mobilize labor to send rice, for instance, to support the war effort. And exactly that's what, and labor that was sent to war fronts in Southeast Asia, which was supported by Suharto and by clerics and by other traditional leaders. They all sort of supported these, which is actually, I mean, it's basically a huge crime against the Indonesian people, but they did do these things. I think why they accepted to do these things. So it's not just the nationalists, but also various kings and nobilities and also religious leaders. They all sort of supported the Japanese project. But I think Anna has explained that there's not much option there, but also that by doing so they did have access, as Blimada has explained, to the state itself, right? So in that sense, I think strategically they were thinking on those terms. I think Sukarno probably also was definitely saddened by that fact that he sent so many Indonesians to their deaths.
He felt like it was necessary to create the kind of conditions for independence ultimately, and we'll discuss this later. But he did successfully create the conditions for that. He had a point. Yeah,
it's a difficult thing to because it's a very touchy subject in Indonesia today, because of course then if you want to confront the full moral implication of it, it is very, and I don't think we have actually confronted it significantly in Indonesian society. So traditionally we would just shy away from asking those difficult questions.
As it became more and more clear that the Japanese were going to lose the war, or were losing the war, they began to usher in a choreographed, controlled process to explore Indonesian independence. How did these later years of the war play out in terms of on the one hand, the position and role of nationalist leadership, and on the other, these intensifying Japanese efforts toward the mass mobilization of the Indonesian population?
So by late 1944, right? So after major losses in the Pacific, Japan basically publicly promised future independence for Indonesia. But we must see this not as a kindness gesture, but it's a wartime strategy, right? Because what Japan really wanted was a gradual, controlled independence under Japanese supervision, and a transfer of power that was aligned with the Japanese strategic interest. That's what they wanted, and that's why they continue to promise independence for Indonesia. And so nationalist figures like Sukarno and Hatta during this time, they were moved to the center of the political stage. They're given greater public prominence. They're allowed to speak openly of independence within limits. And they were also brought into formal consultative bodies. So in the early 1945, Japan actually established BPUPKI, BPUPKI, which is the investigating committee for preparatory work for independence. This is a body that's composed largely of Indonesian leaders to draft a constitution. And this is also a period which competing visions of Indonesia's future were discussed, right? Like, for instance, especially regarding religion and the place of Islam, for example, vis-a-vis the state structure. So all of this began to crystallize during this time. But also what's really important, tying it back to our conversation just now, is that the Indonesian society at this point was also already deeply militarized and politically organized, right? We have expanded militia training, we have broader arming of the Indonesian auxiliaries. Let me just emphasize that during the Dutch time, Indonesian people were never armed. You know, the Dutch would never ever did that, right? Except for to be a part of the Dutch army, obviously, but not for Indonesia, for Indonesian military. So then there was also, as Made has mentioned before, a greater nationalist rhetoric in public ceremonies, you know, the use of Indonesian language, and then political education was also framed around sacrifice and unity. So what we're seeing is that as the Japanese militarily weakened, the Indonesian political organization was actually strengthened, right? And then when the atomic bombings occurred and Japan surrendered, this repressed energy, just imagine a pressure cooker, you know, this repressed energy exploded essentially, right? And this is why Japan wanted a gradual transfer of sovereignty, but in Indonesia, the Indonesian youth, the pemuda that Abi mentioned before, pushed for immediate independence. Right, and that's why Sukarno and Hatta was then, later on was kidnapped, and then he was, they were forced to actually proclaim independence for Indonesia.
Just to pause you there, this was August 15th of 1945. Emperor Hirohito announces Japan's surrender after the U.S. nuclear bomb attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and 2 days later, on August 17th, 1945, Sukarno, under pressure from these militant youth radicals, he reads the Declaration of Independence.
Yes, exactly. So when Japan fell, right, there was no vacuum of political imagination. We had a prepared revolutionary society. These people were ready, to take over, right? So the Declaration of Proclamation did not emerge in just 2 days, like you just mentioned, from the 15th to the 17th, but rather it has been built throughout the Japanese occupation.
These people who kidnapped this pemuda, this youth who kidnapped Sukarno and Hatta, is quite young. I think they are the leftists, right? So that's also show that that the left, after in a hiatus for quite a while, since the last decade of the Dutch, and also in the early period of the Japanese, making a comeback and become very, very radicals. And also Tan Malaka with the Persatuan Perjuangan, the United Struggle, it already started the work for launching a revolution. At the same time, in this very interesting time, there's a clash not only between the revolutionaries and the more thoughtful and deliberate older people like Sukarno and the people at the committee to prepare for independence, but also starting a mobilizations of the youth, what Abby talked before, of the youth to carry out the revolution. So this kind of things, I think the clash between these two power, one is the elites, one is the masses, it will determine the futures of Indonesia.
It's interesting that the Japanese, of course, why did the Japanese provided such help towards independence? Although, as as Anna has said, it's with caveat. Like they want to. But for instance, after Rengas Dengklok, when Sukarno came back to Jakarta, he wrote the Indonesian Declaration of Independence in the house of a Japanese admiral, Admiral Maeda, who supported personally Indonesian independence. So you see, within the Japanese administration, there were people who were committed to supporting Indonesian independence. So we can't really see the Japanese as just this monolith, but that there were parties in the government that were supportive. What's really interesting is that after the war in the 50s, many of these people would come to Indonesia as a representative of Japanese capital, actually, to sort of negotiate for access to resources or investments and so forth. And they had a lot of contacts within the national government because, of course, these were the people that they were working together or that they were as a boss during the Japanese period. So I think especially by the time of the late by 44 to 45, there was a general consensus among people in the Japanese leadership in Indonesia that they were going to lose the war. Right? It's very much obvious that there was no path towards victory, and they were preparing for what comes next. So to support the current Indonesian independence would be the most profitable route of action for them, because then they would have people in the government. And that's really what happened afterwards, that they would then have access to, because eventually Japan would control a lot of Indonesian investments and, industries. It's in this, especially the 60s, 70s, and up to today, so much of Indonesian economy is run by Japanese companies, the Indonesian automotive sector and so forth. But what's interesting is those personal relations that were developed during the Japanese occupation gave access to Japanese companies later on in the 50s. Yeah.
Also important is to highlight the historical contingency here. In a way that if Japan did not lose, Sukarno's gamble was actually faltered, right? Would falter. So there is historical contingency in a sense that the Japanese first did not actually intend to create an independent Indonesia. They did destroy Dutch authority, mobilize the masses, arming Indonesians, train the administrators down to the village level, created this Indonesian, language, or nationalist ritual, etc. It made rapid independence possible, and in some ways, yes, Sukarno's gamble did lay a lot of the groundwork, but it only succeeded because Japan lost, because the youth, the Pemuda forced urgency. Blimadas already said also how this older generation was reflective. They wanted to take their time, but the youth is like, no, you gotta do this. So the fact that the leadership moved decisively in a very narrow window of, power vacuum, this is all the historical contingency, because the Dutch would quickly come, very quickly to gain back, the archipelago.
As Made mentioned earlier, communists had begun to return to the archipelago during this period, including in 1942, Tan Malaka, and he would end up leading a more radical flank of the independence struggle, something that we'll get deeper into later on. What did it look like when these communists pushed deep underground or into exile under this severe repression? What did it look like when they began to re-enter Indonesian political life under the Japanese occupation?
A lot of the communists at this time were either in exile or went underground, right? Those people in exile were Tan Malaka, Musso, Alimin, Semaun, Rustam Effendi, and among them were actually also they're fragmented. Tan Malaka has split with the Komintern and created PARI, Partai Republik Indonesia, or the Party of the Indonesian Republic. Also, during this time, a lot of these leaders were either sympathetic to communism or actually they were socialists. I think we talk about it at the beginning that Hatta, Syahrir, they were actually socialists. Hatta, in fact, represented Indonesia in the League for Anti-Imperialism that was organized by the Comintern in Brussels in 1931. So a lot of these people, a lot of these socialists and communists, because they were able to sojourn somehow in abroad, right? They were very cosmopolitan. They're European educated. And also, even though they were not necessarily communists like Amir Sharifuddin and Shahrir, they're anti-communist and socialist. They have this, also Sukarno, right? In some sense, they were sympathetic to the cause. And so during this time in 1942, there was already, even before that, there was already this underground movement. Amir Sharifuddin, because he was against the collaborationist of Sukarno and Hatta, he actually led the underground movement of the PKI, in fact, in 1942 to 1945. So, and then Tan Malaka returned, and a lot of his sympathizers. Actually, the story of Tan Malaka returning was really interesting because for a long time, he actually did not reveal that he was in fact Tan Malaka. He was just listening, to people talking about himself and his, without telling people that, oh, I'm the legend, the legendary revolutionary. I'm back. He didn't do that. But again, during the Japanese era, especially 1945, a lot of the Digul internists, they returned. They came back. And then they would then quickly revive PKI. So PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, was actually revived in October, I think, of 1945, just a few months after the proclamation of the independence, but partly by the Digul graduates, and also these people who were already moving underground. And so what we are seeing in here is that how there was a connection between 1927 and later PKI movement in the independence era, in a way that the PKI was both revived by the Digul people and so the older generation and also the newer generation who have been reviving the memory and also the revolutionary zeal of PKI throughout the repressive era of 1930s and early 1940s. Also important to mention that Musso actually returned. So Musso was another PKI leader. We talk about it when we talk about Cokro Aminoto's house, right? He actually returned. He has been in Russia for the whole time. After he fled in 27, but he returned to the Indies in 1935 to try to revive PKI, and then went back. And then later he came back in 1948. And we'll talk about him more, I think, when we talk about Madiun affairs.
Just to add with what Anna has said, I guess what's really interesting is why did the communist leadership, a lot of them returned after the Japanese occupation, right? And the PKI was revived in 45, and then you have, although Tan Malaka returned a bit earlier, he didn't become part of the national leadership. Nor Musso came, and then he was trying to take over the national leadership, in a sense, right, of Indonesia. So these communists were somewhat fish out of water, in a sense, because they didn't position themselves as leaders during the Japanese occupation. So I think they had a problem with legitimacy. Obviously, it's much more complex than that. And then you'll have the Madiun affair. But it's an interesting point that a lot of these people would be killed by the nationalists, by Sukarno, Hatta, by the groups there, primarily because they don't have the fealty of the army. It might have been crucial for the communists to have been in Indonesia, to the communist leadership to have been in Indonesia during the Japanese occupation, so that they could have occupied a much more legitimate position. So it might explain why there was such problems during the Revolutionary War.
Under the Japanese occupation, PKI continued to be illegal. And in fact, they continued to be, that's why they had to move underground, right? Because they were still arrested. The Japanese would still arrest communist people if they found one. So the communists continue to be repressed.
You had this interesting case of Amir Sharifuddin, who was then sentenced to death by the Japanese, right? And then Sukarno rescued him by negotiating with the Japanese. But then you could have seen that with Amir Sharifuddin, Sukarno developed a relationship that was personal, and Amir Sharifuddin would become the prime minister after independence. I'm saying that during the Japanese occupation, there was a congealing of leadership, of national leadership, which allowed even communists like Amir Sharifuddin to be part of it. but not people like Muso or Tan Malaka, because they weren't part of that occupation government. And they returned later, and then they had a much more difficult place to put within the national pantheon, even though they're big names during the colonial national movement. But when they came back in the late 40s, they were nothing, and then they were killed by the National Army. So in that sense, again, it's to emphasize how important the Japanese period is in that relation, I think. Yeah.
And also, as we'll get to, just how many rounds of repression ending in just the most brutal repression of communists ever that happened to Indonesian communists. Made.
Yeah, I just add a little bit about the communists, but also we need to also to talk about, besides Islam, the Japanese create, and also these occupation authorities need a manpower in order to confront the Allied. So they began to mobilize. They create a militia called Defenders of the Homeland, or PITA, Pembela Tanah Air. So from these mobilizations come the basic structures of Indonesian military, which is, I think, adopting so many techniques of the Japanese authorities at the time in order to subjugate or to control Indonesian society later on. But it's very interesting that probably because of the repressions to the communists were unable to infiltrate this homeland defenders militia. And then also, I think the second historical mistake that they did was that in 1948, during the revolutions, they launched rebellions in Madiun. That we will talk about that quite long. But if you look at what the main the actors of the revolutions from 1945 to 1949 some of the leftists were there, but I think the leaderships were in the hand of the militia were created by the Japanese authorities. The communists was unable to infiltrate in this kind of military structures. That, I think, the biggest mistakes of the communists is, unlike the communists in China, unlike a communist in Vietnam who infiltrate the military and create their own militia. The Indonesian communists has a very mixed feelings towards the military. So then later on, they become the victims of the military.
I think Blimade, with the exception of Amir, right? Because Amir is PKI, and then he did become the second prime minister after Shahrir, and then he was then also was involved in the Madiun affair and was in fact killed.
We'll get into this more when we get deep into the revolusi or revolution, which is a complex, many-sided story. But just to set the scene, the Japanese surrender, combined with Sukarno declaring independence, this puts Japanese troops in Indonesia in a strange position. They had to maintain the status quo, technically, across the archipelago until Allied troops could take charge. But again, Indonesians had declared independence, rejecting that very return of colonial governance.
Yeah, in a sense, I think the Japanese opened, the Pandora's box of Indonesian mass nationalism, and they afterwards they had absolutely no way to control it. The qualitative difference between Indonesian nationalism during the colonial period and during the late Japanese period is, of course, its mass appeal. its mass participation. And so in that sense, it's a much more democratic nationalism, but it's also a much more messier nationalism, one in which the Indonesian elite also has never really fully controlled. And we'll see that in the revolution, is that yes, there's an Indonesian republic, but it's actually composed of various republics. It's actually a messy, and it's actually and people were fighting amongst one another and so forth, and it's an interesting phenomena in which a huge amount of people participated and not just took over the state, but participated as the state. And then you have then sort of a rush of people into the state. This is something which would have been horrifying for a Dutch colonial administrator to have seen, but they're not there at the moment. But this is something that's so fundamentally different, and it's something that remains one of the key differences, in a sense, of Indonesian post-colonial state, is that constant sort of much more expansive participatory relations with society to the state.
How did nationalist collaboration with the Japanese occupiers on the part of leaders like Sukarno and Hatta, on the one hand, versus, on the other, the refusal to collaborate on the part of left-wing leaders like Shahrir and Amir Sharafuddin, how did that all lay the groundwork for the eruption of the revolution and for all these conflicts that would pretty soon divide its leading political forces? Or maybe to put it a little more directly, was Sukarno right? Did his quite morally compromised decision to collaborate with the Japanese indeed successfully lay the groundwork for independence? And then what, by contrast, were the consequences for the left-wing figures and forces who had refused collaboration?
So there were two nationalist strategies under the Japanese occupation between 42 to 45. On the one hand, there is the collaboration camp with Sukarno and Hatta. They believed that the cooperation would lead to Indonesian independence. On the other hand, and then second, there is the refuse to collaborate camp. There is Shahrir and Amir, who organized underground resistance. Now, what did the collaboration achieve, right? So the nationalist leaders gained mass visibility and political legitimacy through cooperation. The Japanese authorities allowed mass mobilization, propaganda, and political training of Indonesians. Also, and because of that, through the collaboration, we were able to create youth organizations, militias, and administrative networks that later supported the revolution. Now, on the other hand, the anti-collaboration camp, they are able to achieve through their underground movement, they're able to achieve or maintain moral credibility and anti-fascist legitimacy. And this is very important later when Japan was defeated, right? But what's really interesting is that after independence of 1945, these different wartime strategies created political divisions, right? That will actually get carried on until later among the nationalist leaders, that later, it shaped early conflicts within the revolutionary government, and then it carried over later about, between these two camps of collaboration, non-collaboration. So in practical terms, to answer your question then, Sukarno's collaboration did help create political infrastructure and mobilize the population that made rapid independence possible. But it came with moral compromise and lasting political controversy, right? That we will see later with Madiun, for example. And how about with the left? Well, the left went underground. And the left was also politically, separated and conflicted. And then I think we will discuss this later as we talk about Madiun.
Yeah, maybe just to add with what Anna has said, I think the question is really difficult, Dan, whether it was the right thing for Sukarno to do. But I think in that sense, collaborating with the Japanese put leverage for Sukarno, because he was able to, I think we discussed this a bit last time, he was able to sort of position himself within a new sort of relations with military officers, with the bureaucracy, and this so he had the biggest lever of state amongst any other Indonesian leadership, exactly because of his strategic position during the Japanese occupation. So now the question is whether it benefited him, because then it would allow him to maintain his centrality throughout the revolution and afterwards. But whether, for instance, had he not been in that position, other alternative political powers or politicians like Tan Malaka or the PKI would have been a much greater threat to him. But whether that position was central to Indonesia's independence, that's something which is a bit, I can't say for sure. It could have gone either way. But what was more important is that his position during the Japanese occupation cemented his position as the leader, or as the founder of the republic, right? As the founder of Indonesian independence. And so he has a symbolic centrality in Indonesian ideological discourse. So that's why he could maintain his position all the way up to 65. Whether had he not done that, Indonesia would not achieve independence, that's something I'm not sure we can conclude.
Yeah, I think this is a very unique situation at that time. Sukarno was regarded as a primus inter pares, or the elders among all of the people. I think he's the most senior. People look up at him because of his proximity to the Japanese rulers. He has some sort of power. I agree with Abi, but also unique because there's so many actors during that time, and so many political power that Sukarno himself, he didn't represent any of them or command any of them. So he preferred to, as a leader, he preferred to above the fray, above all of the groups. So he belongs to all of the groups, but he didn't control any of them. So this is a very, very unique Indonesia. I think all of his career, Sukarno, even until he became president, he put himself the way it's above all of this. He represents the nation. He represents the unity. Yeah, he's on the top, but yet at the same time he didn't control anything. So below him, so many groups and so many ideologies that cannot be reconciled with each other. So there's a huge infighting among these groups. There's a communist, there's a semi-communist, there's a nationalist, there are leftist nationalists, there's a Muslim communist, and etc. It's so many, not to mention the languages, not to mention the tribes or the ethnic groups. And this is a very typical Indonesia, I think. Even we inherit that when we talking about the modern era, how the leader in Indonesia try to become not only controlling one party system, but try to be above all, but not really control one group, except later on when the military took over the power.
Before we get into the first 2 years of the revolution, which is like all of the revolution and really like all of Indonesian history, incredibly complex, let's discuss what sort of armed forces that this new Indonesian republic had at its disposal. In the wake of the Japanese surrender and the Indonesian Declaration of Independence, the proclamasi that followed soon after, the Japanese immediately, very quickly, moved to disarm and demobilize these militias that they had formed, militias that had been formed among the Indonesian masses with the aim of resisting a possible allied invasion. These militias were called PETA, but nonetheless, zealously militant armed groups known as Pemuda soon formed and spread all across the archipelago. And at the same time, regular military units began to take shape, and they were led by veterans of Dutch and Japanese colonial forces. Meanwhile, some Japanese commanders in this very new situation of sudden surrender, some helped the Indonesian cause and provided weapons, and some would even stay behind to fight the Revolutionary War. But in other places, Pemuda and Japanese troops came into bloody conflict. How did both the Pemuda militia and formal nationalist military units get formed so quickly at such a giant scale after independence was declared? How do we understand, on the one hand, the Pemuda, who, alongside engaging in fights with the Japanese, British, and Dutch troops, also committed many atrocities, brutal murders of Indo-Japanese European civilians. And then, on the other hand, how do we understand, how did this formal and more official armed forces of the Republic become organized and established? Forces that would lay the groundwork for what would ultimately become a decisive and ultimately decisively reactionary force in Indonesian national politics, the Indonesian National Armed Forces, or TNI.
Beli made duluan. This is your area.
This is also Indonesian military was very, very unique here because at first, during the revolutions, this is the self-made military. No government ever built the military. So it is created by the people. They used to join the became a professional military officers during the Dutch era, and then also the Japanese militia. But I think they tried, the people like Nasution, who was a cadet, or the students in the military academy in Bandung. But then the Japanese occupation happened, and then he quit from that school and then making a comeback. He's very young at that time, making a comeback during the revolution era with the thinking about organizing one professional army, but not just a professional army, because he saw firsthand how easily to mobilize the youth. Even it becomes a doctrine of Indonesian military until now that we have a doctrines of people's war. Yeah, this is not done by only the professional army, but also by the people. It is in Indonesian. It's called Pertahanan Rakyat Semesta, which is the all over resilience of the country dependent on the people. So it's because the reason is very simple. Indonesia is very poor, and at that time, even until now, we don't have much wealth to buy arms. We cannot compete with other power. But we have manpower who are dedicated to the independence of our country. So based on that ideas, Indonesian military forces comprise of so many elements at first. As I said before, there's a PITA and the Dutch officers, and then there's a lot of Pemudas, a lot of jihadists also participating in that. This is kind of later on it became a warlordism, but then it was organized locally, along religious line, along ethnic lines, but I think the most unique features of Indonesian revolutions that there's also mobilization across age or across generations. That's called Pemuda, the youth. How can you define it? It's really a fluid concept. Yeah, it's a temporary concept. You are not become a youth forever. You're only in certain time of your life. That's I think the unique phenomenon of Indonesian revolution and the start of Indonesian military, and because of that, it's really hard for the civilian government at the time to control the military. Of course, they say that, well, we are taking orders from the government. That's the military will say that. But at the same time, if the order from the government like is not in line with their interests, they are just disobey that. Just like in the Renville agreement. So a lot of the military said, well, yeah, we don't acknowledge that agreement. So that's actually they are rebelling against the civilian government. But then there's always tensions between the military and the civilian until later on they become autonomous, semi-autonomous institution, or we can call it the state. Within the state, they are becoming bigger and bigger and stronger, and then they eventually took over the power. That's another story.
Mada, as you just mentioned, the Indonesian military was a force that operated independently or relatively autonomously from civilian government from the very beginning. Commanders named an officer named Sudirman their first commander-in-chief directly without seeking approval from Sukarno or any sort of civilian leadership. They just considered that their prerogative. How does that compare to what we saw in other Asian anti-colonial militaries, like, let's say, the Tatmadaw in Burma? Is the TNI unique, or is this a pattern that we see elsewhere?
I think, yeah, I'm not really an expert on Tatmadaw or any other. I read a little bit about what happened outside Indonesia, but I think the special features in Indonesia is that the army is created by the element of the civil society. So it is not under the control of any power. For example, if you in Vietnam, you have the Communist Party. Yeah, they created the People's Army. In Indonesia, they all Persatuan Perjuangan, Tan Malaka also have an envision to create an army, but it failed. Yeah, because he cannot control. He only mobilized a small number of people, but then I don't know, somehow because of the spirit, heated spirit of the revolution, so a lot of people want to participate in this, and then they must find a channel, and they automatically organize themselves first as because there's some professional soldiers also inside this movement, so they organize themselves regionally, and then they elected their own commanders. That's also happened in the local level, and then at quote unquote at the national level. So this is the army that creating itself out of a lot of components inside it, and then after that, as a consequence, just a few years after independence, when they tried to reorganize the army, then rationalize the army, and they have to get rid a lot of people who are not qualified as the military. Then it start the trouble, yeah, start the rebellion everywhere, because well, we are in this together, and then after this become the former army, you kick me out from this organization. So you see a lot of regional rebellion everywhere. One of the biggest is in West Java by Darul Islam and Tentara Islam Indonesia, the Indonesian Islamic Army.
Yeah, within the core of the emergence of the TNI, there were two components. One is based on the colonial academy, a military academy based in Bandung. The other one is, of course, the PETA, the one that the Japanese trained army. But as Blimade has explained, there's actually a variety of independent forces. So it's a panoply of various forces. But I think what's important is that there is a bit of a compromise, especially between these two forces, between the PETA, which represented by Sudirman. And Sudirman has a special position because he's within a position as a spiritual symbol of the army. So he holds that spirit, that there's a strong element of radical spiritual nationalism that's within the army. And partly this is because of the experience during the Japanese period. So within the PETA, they've sort of honed in a very strong ideological position of warrior, like Bushido kind of spirit that permeates the PETA ideology. Now, within the more formal, more professional Bandung segment of the army, they're more experienced in the tradition of European professional army, but these two sides sort of converged. They will have a problem later on in the 50s, but during this period, they sort of represent the army. And if you look at what happened in the 40s, so the army was shedding a lot of. So you had, of course, the Madiun rebellion. You also had the Darul Islam. These are actually infighting within the army itself, right? Because it's defining who is part of the army and who isn't. And so the emergence of the National Army by the 1950s was the result of shedding Islamist elements and shedding communist elements. And so, especially after Madiun and after Darul Islam, the army was specifically right-wing, specifically professional, and it has imbued within this sort of Japanese, almost fascist tradition of warrior spirit. Now, why exactly is the state unable to counter that? I think the period of the social revolution is central to this, because during this time, there was a period of lull where there was no state authority. But it wasn't just that there was no state authority. There was an effort by Pemuda groups, by various parts of society, to destroy any form of state authority. So during the social revolution, there's this term called pendaulatan, which means to enforce sovereignty. And it's a form of the people saying, we are taking over sovereignty from your authority. So and in Sumatra and other places, that meant violence against the nobilities, against officials. But what happened is that effectively the state crumbled even further in the first year of revolution. And so that sort of opened the field for the army to go into and take over a lot of these institutions, including companies, including so various sectors of the state, of society, of government were taken over by people of the Pemuda, and a lot of them affiliated with the army, but some also affiliated with the communists and other elements. But basically, the state was sort of taken over by society in that sense, and this is something which we grapple with even today. This collapse of authority, of state authority in the early Republican period, in the early revolutionary period, has a very long ramification up till today. So I guess in that context, probably first of all, the expansion of participation during the Japanese period, coupled with Japanese sort of Bushido spirit, which imbued the PETA, but also not just PETA, but a lot of elements in Indonesian society. And then later on, the collapse of authority, of state authority, positioned the army in a very unique way in Indonesian history. And so that's why they've maintained a very strong independence, which remains even up till today to an extent. The big question of Indonesia has always been about civil supremacy towards the military. And that has been the question which remains relevant up till the present period.
Yeah, we've been talking about the relationship between the military and the government. What sort of government even existed at the outset of the revolution? Sukarno read the Proklamasi, the Declaration of Independence, but what did that mean in terms of actual administrative power over so many people, such vast and still very indeterminate territory, very, very far from Java?
Yeah, I mean, for one thing, Indonesia is very vast, right? So it differs from one area to another. I think one important thing is that basically there is no unified government. For instance, in terms of currency, each region in Indonesia produces their own currency. So there was like 18 currencies published by different authorities during that period. And in a lot of places in Java, the collapse of authority meant that in some places the military sort of took over. So the military actually functioned as the state. They tax, they do all these public services, and that's also the same case in other areas in which other groups like the PKI or other groups, they sort of took over and took over government. So the state itself is somewhat of a fiction in the sense that there is no unified republic. And if you think about because in 1946 the capital of the republic moved from Jakarta to Yogyakarta, right? The reason why that's the case is because the Sultan of Jogja was able to maintain its traditional bureaucracy. So within Indonesia, one of the few places, or within the republic, one of the few places where the state and the government still exist in its sort of normal form was Yogyakarta, because of the presence of the old Yogyakarta kingdom, and because during the Japanese period, the Sultan was elevated by the Japanese to take over the government of the kingdom of Jogja, and so it strengthened the position of the. But what that meant was that Jogja was really one of the few stable places where government was present. But if you look at what happened in Jogja, it's actually just a place for government officials to go in, and show themselves. It's a revolving door, really, of because people like Sukarno, they were traveling all over the place in Indonesia. A lot of the Indonesian leaders were traveling all over the place. So Jogja is also somewhat symbolic, but it was much more substantial than other places in the republic where authority collapsed. So, and then of course you had the other side is the Dutch part of the Republic of Indonesia when the Dutch expanded. So Batavia was under the Dutch control in 40, Jakarta was under Dutch control in 46, and other places were under Dutch control, and they were normal places. So there were places where the Dutch were saying this is what government looks like. But Jogja was an important place for Indonesia, for the Republic to show that we can also do this normal state business. But outside of Jogja, it's not really the case. It's really much more fragmented, and there's less authority, there's less structure that was present.
Mm-hmm. Just to add very quickly, after the independence, right, there is very little real administrative control for the civilian government. So they're grappling. Abi has explained this to us very well. So the authority was uneven. They're often dependent on local power holders, right, instead of central command. But I want to just highlight that but what we're seeing is actually gaining strength is the military. The military was able to actually, join forces quickly. Of course, not in a coherent way, but the movement in terms of central command, getting, for example, the choice of Sudirman as commander in chief, these military commanders, they, without direct approval from civilian leaders, they could make decisions. And this is actually reflecting how, it's a reflection of how they see themselves as a revolutionary institution, independent from the government. They saw themselves as the guardian of the revolution, not just as a subordinate state institution. So this created an uneven relationship between the Republican government on the one hand and the military leaders from the very beginning. And this will actually continue, right, until later. So because the army emerged through revolutionary struggle rather than civilian control, it retained a strong sense of this autonomy and later became a major political forces in Indonesian politics.
I'm Micah Utricht, editor of Jacobin. You're listening to The Dig, a podcast that brings you an incredibly wide-ranging analysis of politics, history, economics, and more, covering the entire planet at a consistent depth that, frankly, I find a little hard to comprehend. I'm not sure exactly how Dan does it, but I'm pretty sure it's connected to you supporting the podcast at patreon.com/thedig.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is From the Free Speech Movement to the Factory Floor, a collective history of the International Socialists, edited by Andrew Stone Higgins. This landmark volume documents the overlooked history and lasting influence of the International Socialists through the words of its members, including renowned scholar activists Nelson Lichtenstein and Nancy Holmstrom. Founded at UC Berkeley in 1964 as a left-wing civil rights group, the Independent Socialist Club played a key role in the free speech movement, and its members and successor organizations would go on to influence the course of both the Black freedom struggle and the rank-and-file labor insurgency of the 1970s. The organization adhered to the tenets of socialism from below, central to which is the belief that revolutionary Marxism meant an expansion of democracy, not its curtailment. Find From the Free Speech Movement to the Factory Floor at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. In the lead up to the Japanese surrender and Indonesia's declaration of independence, these deliberations between Sukarno, various nationalists, and Islamic leaders were taking place, planning for Indonesian independence and drafting Indonesia's first constitution, a process set in motion by the Japanese to woo Indonesian nationalists. And so that was already in motion when the Japanese surrendered and independence was declared. And this first constitution, it called for a strong presidency and envisioned a state that would encompass then British territories in Malaya and the northern side of Borneo, or Kalimantan, which will become very consequential later on. It also laid out the doctrine of Pancasila, 5 principles that would shape both Sukarno's time in office and Suharto's New Order reaction against it all. The 5 principles were belief in one God, nationalism, humanitarianism, social justice, and democracy. And to appease Islamic leaders, an earlier version of Pancasila had included, quote, belief in one God with the obligation for adherents of Islam to carry out Islamic law. But the final version of the Constitution, adopted alongside the Declaration of Independence in August 1945, it was somewhat softened to just belief in one God. Nonetheless, that version of Pancasila made official this deeply consequential bias in favor of Abrahamic religions and against non-monotheistic religions, traditional beliefs, and atheism. What was this rather idiosyncratic ideological matrix that the revolution put forward to explain and legitimate itself? And how did it draw on various political currents, the various political currents that we've been discussing throughout this series? What was the emerging political project that it all functionally was responding to?
So this discussion on constitution would be important, and I think we will go back to this discussion on constitution when we discuss the guided democracy. But as independence was declared, Sukarno and the nationalist leaders, they drafted 1945 constitution that created a strong presidential system and outlined the ideological foundation of the new republic. So Pancasila is a state ideology. It consists of 5 guiding principles that meant to unify Indonesia's diverse society. 1, to believe in God, and then nationalism, 2nd, nationalism, 3rd, humanitarianism, 4th, democracy, and 5, social justice. And Pancasila was actually designed as a compromise ideology that incorporated the three major ideological streams in Indonesian politics. There is the secular nationalism, the Islamic politics, the left-leaning social justice ideas, right? And the first principle is actually a compromise, right? Because the early draft included the so-called Jakarta Charter, which added the phrase requiring Muslims to follow Islamic law. And so this was meant to, the Jakarta chapter was meant to appease Islamic leaders, that they wanted the state to be to follow Islamic law, right? But later, this was softened to maintain unity among Indonesia's religiously diverse population. So that first one, belief in God, is this negotiation, right? To make sure that we're still able to maintain the unity of the religious diverse population, but also still somehow accommodate the needs, the requirement, or the demand of the Islamic leaders. Now, this ideological matrix, right, you asked about the political purpose. So the ideological matrix was actually a response to the central challenge that's facing the revolution, which is how can we build a unified nation state from a highly diverse archipelago with many religions, ethnicities, and political traditions, right? This is a vast archipelago with disparate polities and the different languages, ethnicities, and histories that was never united in this way before. So this is a way to unite this vast and diverse archipelago into a modern nation state. So Pancasila became this shared ideological language of Indonesian politics, and actually later Sukarno would use this as a pretext or as a basis for guided democracy. And Suharto, during the New Order era, would also use this to justify national unity and political authority, that replaced the Sukarno's regime, the Sukarno's period.
Yeah, as Anne has explained, it's in a way a compromise to, while we think of it as the conception of Sukarno, there was actually several similar Pancasila models that were discussed, including by Muhammad Yamin and some others, and they all were quite similar in that sense. I think Sukarno's first example didn't have the first or had the belief in God at the end of the Pancasila. So the BPUPKI was a forum which would allow for this kind of compromise to emerge. So the first sila was actually not the belief in God, but the belief in one God. And I think the idea was the Islamists wanted only a monotheistic position. What they wanted, in a sense, was because there was a lot of traditional belief systems in Indonesia, and they wanted to sort of regulate the mode of religion by pushing forth monotheistic forms of religion. And in fact, if you think about Hinduism and Buddhism, for instance, in Indonesia, had to also recreate itself into somewhat of a monotheistic religion, because the idea pushed forth by a lot of the Islamists was a form of monotheism. This was done to reduce the variety of faith in Indonesia. And ultimately, it was to sort of strengthen or enforce or push people to enter into Islam or Christianity, but basically monotheistic kind of faith.
Yeah, this is it's a kind of, for me, is after looking at so many ideology and teachings in the world, this is a kind of an odd ideologies, because it combines so many things into one part. And then it's not clear what is the end of the goal of this ideology, except, well, you have this and unity inside it, because we are afraid of our diversity, and it has a social justice in there, because the structure of the society is a very not level in Indonesia. Feudalism is still very, very strong, and then also the inequality is very high. That's the most problematic of all is believe in one God. Believe in one God, as Abby has mentioned, it just pushes people to think about only one God, monotheism. Meanwhile, there's so many belief system in Indonesia, which is not really belief in one God. Hindu has to invent a word for that, Ida Sang Yang Widewasa, which is one God actually, out of so many God. It's probably strange if you compare to Hindu in India. If you talk about Hindu in India about God, they will ask you which God, because there's so many of them. In Indonesia also like that. This is the result of compromise among the founders of the nations. And until now, I think people accept it. But also at the same time, people don't obey it. Yeah, we have an ideology, that's fine. But when we have to follow that, well, it's not really also acceptable. Nobody knows exactly what kind of society that we want to create out of this ideology.
Let's get into the first 2 years of the revolution, which again is a lot. In September 1945, mass protests erupted in Jakarta, and it nearly spiraled into violent conflict with Japanese troops before Sukarno emerged and gave a speech that dispersed the crowd. In Surabaya, a huge conflict, a violent conflict erupted over the raising of the Dutch flag, leading to this massive battle pitting British forces, mainly Indian, against Indonesian Pemuda, led by Sutomo, a really important radio propagandist during the revolution. The Dutch were, during this period, figuring out how to recolonize their former colony. But before Dutch troops arrived, it was mostly British troops who began to secure control of cities like Jakarta. The first mission was to release the large number of Europeans and Indos interned by the Japanese, but of course this was also the first stages of paving the way for the return of Dutch colonial rule. Meanwhile, Pemuda, as was mentioned earlier, committed mass violence against European, Indo, Chinese, and other civilians. There was this widespread localized violent conflict, sometimes described as social revolution, that Abi was discussing earlier and that we'll get into more detail on in a few moments. Meanwhile, Amir Sharifuddin and Sultan Syahrir formed the Socialist Party, or PS. Tan Malaka, no longer a PKI leader, formed an organization called the Struggle Front, and later a group called Morba. Syahrir became Indonesia's first prime minister, and Amir would become its second. After the Dutch retook Jakarta, the Revolutionary Republican government moved into the interior of Java, establishing its capital in Yogyakarta, one of the four central Javanese principalities. Meanwhile, there's this whole other diplomatic track that's extremely important with the Dutch, which results in the signing of the Linggarjati Agreement. And that agreement, it would have led to this creation of a federated United States of Indonesia, this collection of states that would include this Republic of Indonesia comprised of just Java and Sumatra, and then a United States of Indonesia of the rest of the Dutch East Indies that would all together form part of a Dutch-Indonesian union with the Dutch Queen as head of state. And all of this led to intensifying conflict between those seeking compromise and those seeking 100% independence. Take us through the first couple years of the revolution, right up to November 1946, right up to before the signing of the Linggarjati Agreement.
At that time, I think the tension is mostly between the radicals, what I call the radicals and the professional politicians. People like Muhammad Hatta, Shahrir, and all of those intellectuals. Suddenly, they are all rationality and calculations, and how can we build these nations? First, we have to do a diplomacy. We have to reach an agreement with the Dutch because the situation is very difficult. A lot of people are suffering, and ordinary people cannot eat and something like that. So we have to go into order, and then we have to get a deal. This is a professional politician. That's their positions. This is the normal people inside the state who are managing the state at that time. But at the same time, you have the radicals, the revolutionaries, people like Tan Malaka, people like all of the remnants of the Pemuda, people who are organizing the Pemuda, the jihadists, the Laskar, or different kind of militia. That Tan Malaka put it aptly, Merdeka 100% or 100% independence. So this kind of people, no compromise. We will fight until the end. We will spill our blood everywhere. It doesn't matter. We have a lot of people to defend our independence. We are not being controlled by any power in the world. So this kind of different thinking, different quote unquote ideologies will shapes a lot of Indonesians' futures, which the professional politician will really want to organize the state into a normal state, and the radicals wanna do all-out revolutions. And then I think where is the most interesting thing in Indonesian this episode of history is that where the Indonesian military put their side. At that time, the military put their side on the 100% independence. So do anything we can, mobilize. If you don't have guns, so use the spare bamboos in order to confront the enemies. So, and then this kind of cultures, people's war, even until now, the military still think themselves as a people's army. That also justified their intrusion into all the civilian life. I think I remember, even though Nasution at that time, even though he coming from a professional army background, he created a doctrine, wrote a book about the pokok-pokok guerrilla, or the substance of the guerrilla. He has positioned himself as a politician instead of the army generals. That kind of things, I think, at that time, at the crucial period of Indonesian independence or the revolutionary era, that will influence Indonesian state later on.
Yeah, I think the first 2 years, so until probably we can look at it until the first military action of the Dutch, was a period of a social revolution, a lot of tensions, a lot of violence. But at the same time, though, it was also a period of relative unity amongst the various factions in Indonesia. This was before civil war happened later on in the 48 upwards. This was a period in which, while yes, the state is weak and in a lot of sense non-existent, some parts of state structure were being developed. So we're seeing sort of the formation of the foundations of the state, the army, for one thing, but also another important component, which is the foreign ministry or the diplomatic front of Indonesia, which also developed during this period as well. So we can see this first 2 years as a period of sort of consolidation and relative unity, in which later on in 47, 48, and 49 would erupt into civil war, would erupt into a more discrete sort of tensions amongst the various factions.
Anna, as we've referenced a few times, the revolution's early period entailed enormous, widespread, violent class conflict across rural Java, involving Santri and Abangan peasants, some of the latter communist aligned. In Aceh, Republican religious leaders, the ulama, revolted against Dutch aligned aristocrats known as the Ulebalangs. In East Sumatra, leftist Batak and Javanese migrant workers massacred local aristocrats. Why did the revolution against the Dutch also unleash all these conflicts within Indonesian society? And does the term social revolution do a good job describing what was going on?
So the Japanese surrender in 1945 basically removed the structures that had maintained order under colonial rule. So across Indonesia, especially in rural Java and Sumatra, power vacuums allowed long suppressed social tensions to erupt. What are the social tensions? What are these, conflicts? Where can we see the conflicts? One is, between peasants. So peasants and, class conflicts is one of them. Many peasants and rural workers, they had deep resentment against the local aristocrats, landlords, and officials who were associated with the colonial rule, right? So the revolutionary moment, it gave them an opportunity to challenge these hierarchies. And then in rural Java, we have, if you still remember the Santri versus Abangan, right, since the 1920s, these conflicts also occurred, especially because the Abangan peasants are often linked to the leftist or communist networks. So there were conflicts among the Santri and Abangan, and these divisions reflected this broader tensions between Islamic reform movements and the secular or the left-wing politics. Then there is the regional examples of social upheavals in this case. There is in Aceh, Islamic leaders, ulama, they led revolts against the Dutch-aligned aristocratic Ulebalang class. And then in East Sumatra, we have plantation workers and local militants who attacked aristocratic rulers that then killed several members of the Malay elite. Actually, there is a poet, Amir Hamzah, who was also killed then. And so why did the revolution trigger these conflicts, right? That's also an important question. So the nationalist revolution did not just challenge colonial rule, it destabilized existing social hierarchies. The class hierarchies, the religious hierarchies, the regional hierarchies, it destabilized all of them. And so it allowed local actors to actually pursue their own vision, of justice or revenge. There is no longer this, large structure that somehow put this all together. Like colonialism, for example, despite how exploitative it is, it's all erupted. So all of these versions came out. Now, so does the term social revolution really capture this? The term fits, partly because many uprisings involve attacks on aristocracy, landlords, and colonial collaborators. But it also oversimplified, right, if you think about it, because the events were also highly localized. There is no media at the time. So they cannot really coordinate and network. So it's an immediate response and reactions, an immediate reaction. So it's very highly localized and also shaped by by diverse motivations like religion, ethnicity, and personal vendettas, essentially, as much as class politics. So if we think about Indonesian revolution, we need to think of it not only as a national anti-colonial struggle, but it was also a period of internal social upheaval because of this rupture or destruction of the old, essentially, the old structure.
I think at that time also the revolution unleashed the spirit of anti-feudalism, which is very strong in so many places in Indonesia. As you see that people thought at that time that the feudal, the high class, the aristocracy is part of the Dutch government. In fact, they are part of the, as you see, we talked before, that they become part of the colonial bureaucracy. And then, so all of the angers that the lower people has against the Dutch, because there's no Dutch anymore, so they directed it to the aristocracy, not only in the region that you mentioned, but also in what's the northern coast of Java, the area around Tegal, Brebes, Pekalongan, and something like that. And even also in Bali, the anti-caste movements, anti-aristocracy movement is a very, very strong, especially from the leftists. The culprit, actually, the left at the time, against the feudal class, the aristocracy. And in North Sumatra, I think it's more clearer people, Batak Karo, the leftist Batak Karos, and the Javanese ex-indentured labor over there. They are kicked out from the land, which is before all of the companies that operated in that area has to pay rent to the local ruler. So, and then this is the revolutions create a windows of opportunity to seize this land. And the conflict on this land, it's going on even until now. Yeah, if you look at the agrarian conflict in North Sumatra or East Sumatra, most of the conflicts has their roots in this period. People want to confiscate or people want to seize the land which once belonged to the aristocracy. And also in Bali, and also I think in some part of Java is also it's unsolved problem even until now. But basically this is the revolution. This is a social revolution because people really want to have an agrarian reform. People really want the means of production for their own. Not a lot like the aristocracy had before, but just enough for them to live.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a really strong sort of class component associated with this sort of explosion of violence, but it's very much related to who profited within the colonial system. And, so a lot of the victims during this period are people who were considered associated with being part of the old regime, colonial regime, and part of the sort of capitalist extraction class. And this, of course, also thus has its racial dimensions and ethnic dimensions, but it isn't an expression of racism, for instance, or an expression of, it's really much more an expression of class disgust towards parts of indigenous society that were competitors to Dutch capitalism. So this does include, for instance, attack on the Chinese communities, attacks on the Indo-Europeans, attack on people associated with authorities, as we've discussed, right, with government officials and so forth. But primarily, it's put forth within the context, within the frame of class analysis. And it's part of that a long tradition of Indonesian ideology, of Indonesian nationalism that is very much affected by this perspective that is Marxist and that is class-based.
Let's turn to the next couple years of the revolution. The Linggarjati Agreement quickly elicited a bitterly negative reaction from both right-wing Dutch political currents and also from radical Indonesian independence activists. In the Netherlands, there was even a serious right-wing military coup plot that sought to maintain the colonial status quo, even though this agreement in so many ways was so tilted toward the Dutch position from the get-go. But that's just how unwilling, how resistant Dutch political culture was to any sort of change in the colonial status quo. Meanwhile, on the ground in South Sulawesi, Raymond Westerling led a brutal Dutch counterinsurgency campaign that involved widespread civilian massacres. And basically, the Dutch were constantly proving Indonesian skeptics of negotiation right. As these massacres were taking place across South Sulawesi, the Dutch colonial authorities unilaterally began to create puppet states, first in eastern Indonesia and West Kalimantan, and then on July 20th, 1947, they launched a direct military assault on the Republic, an assault that they characterized in really classic colonial euphemism as the first police action, which Indonesians more accurately described as military aggression, really a truly quite brutal, murderous aggression that, among other things, aimed to bring key economic enterprises back under Dutch control. At the same time, the Dutch continued to create these new puppet states, additional new puppet states, South Sumatra, East Java, East Sumatra, ultimately 15 states in all. How did the Linggarjati Agreement come together, and then how did it so spectacularly, so quickly fall apart? Take us from Linggarjati to the eve of January 1948, when yet another agreement, the Renville Agreement, would be signed between the Republic and the Dutch.
I guess, the Linggarjati Agreement was seen by a lot of people in the Republic, including people within the military, as a major concession to the Dutch. So the Linggarjati Agreement sort of resulted in the fall of Shahrir's cabinet. So it really destroyed his political legitimacy. And so his government would fall, and the second Shahrir's cabinet would arise from that. And that would then result in Amir Sharifuddin emerging as the next prime minister of Indonesia. But I think in that sense, it solidified within the military, it solidified the idea that the civilian government, that the civilian leadership was not ready to fight for Indonesian independence, that they would compromise the Dutch too much. And this actually is also shared by the more radical elements like Tan Malaka and the PKI. So in that sense, this is the start of the collapse of the somewhat semi-unity that Indonesia state had achieved in the early 2-year periods, right? This because after that it showed an increasing level of distrust within the factions in the Republic, in particular, for instance, between the military and the political leadership, the politician, but also with the more radical elements there. Linggarjati is seeded the civil war to come, in a sense, and the collapse of the kind of unity that it has achieved in the earlier periods. The development of puppet states was not really. So the Dutch tried to develop puppet states, but they really didn't have depth to them, and I think that would later on be shown after 1949, when a lot of the puppet states decided to disband themselves. So within the Dutch, they don't understand the Indonesian situation very well. They don't understand the level of the depth of nationalism that has been achieved in such a short period of time. They don't understand that. So a lot of their maneuvers really was not going anywhere, because the development of puppet states, for instance, was at surface level.
Yeah, well, this Linggarjati this create the what especially in the region. We look at it at that time, it creates a situation, a distrust to the central government, and especially within the military, this is to start a distrust to the civilian government. So, still remember that as a consequence of this distrust, and later on, I think the military, the army, has to be forced to go to Yogyakarta, but that's the later period. But it is the start of distrust, not only to the army, but also for the elements in the region, especially toward the central government in Jakarta and Yogyakarta at the time. Yeah.
In January 1948, the Republican Dutch signed another accord, the Renville Agreement, which was named for the U.S. naval ship that it was signed aboard. That deal led to a new round of intense disagreements, conflict between various factions of the Islamic group Masyumi, as well as a split of the left wing into separate camps, led respectively by Sharir and Amir. It also prompted Amir to resign as prime minister, who was then replaced by Hatta. In West Java, the Indonesian Islamic State, Darul Islam, we've discussed it a few times, or referenced it a few times. This began to take shape as Republican forces, namely the Siliwangi Division, and that's an important military force to remember. The Siliwangi Division will be a recurrent character in this history. They withdrew from West Java under the terms of the Renville Agreement, which was even more tilted toward the Dutch than Linggarjati had been. And so the Siliwangi Division of the Republican military withdraws from West Java. In its place emerges this Islamic revolt against both the Dutch and the Republic, led by Islamic radical and mystic Karto Surwiryo, a man that we discussed earlier in the series because he, alongside nationalist Sukarno, communist Musso, various other important leaders, they all spent their childhood years at the very same boarding house in Surabaya run by Serikat Islam leader Cokro Aminoto. So just to re-emphasize again and again how sort of specific the layer of Indonesian society it is that's forming the leadership class of all of these conflicting political currents in this giant country. It's really quite remarkable. Anyhow, how did the Renville Agreement, again, even more tilted toward Dutch power than Linggarjati had been, how did it get made? And more specifically, what does Renville reveal about the U.S.'s orientation towards Dutch colonialism in Indonesia at this time? Because that orientation would quite radically change in the years to come due to Cold War considerations. But at this time, they're on a U.S. naval ship under U.S. pressure, signing a very, very pro-Dutch agreement. And then lastly, why did the signing of Renville and its implementation, why did it lead to such intense conflict among these Indonesian political forces?
I guess at the time that America, the U.S., think about Indonesia as a country, because before it's a Linggarjati. The Dutch is dividing Indonesia into several states. So the Indonesia become the Republik Indonesia Serikat, the United Republic of Indonesia. I think that's the imagination, I think, fit with the U.S. condition, which is the United States. And Indonesia, after the Renville, become only one state with the capital and also the territory only in Yogyakarta, which is a very small place. I think it becomes the center of Indonesia. With that agreement, all of the Indonesian military has to be transferred into Yogyakarta. This is what they call it in the military, as a long march from Bandung to, especially in the case of Siliwangi, a long march from Bandung to Yogyakarta. And at the same time, because Bandung has void of security forces, especially the military, enter the Darul Islam movement, the Indonesian Islamic Army movement led by Kartosuwiryo. That's the start. And then looking at that also because Bandung is on the southern part of Java, in the eastern part of Java, in the city of Madiun, there's another movements also because of the void of the military. The pockets of resistance have to move to Yogyakarta following the Rinfel agreement into the territory of the republics. There's also a void. So the leftists also try to make something in there, that kind of situation. And I think the U.S. until at this point, I think is interested to see the United States of Indonesia. But then after that, they realized that this is not right because of the dynamics. They saw that the dynamics firsthand. They saw that the Indonesian nationalism is actually quite big and spread evenly in the archipelago. So later on, they changed the course. But I think during the Renville, the United States think that Indonesia should be like the U.S., where you have so many states and interstate relationship was determined by commerce. You have the central government and something like that, but it didn't work. Yeah, in Indonesia. And you see all of the radicals, especially the rights in form of the Islamic movement, explode in West Java and Aceh, also starting that time, and then it spread to Kalimantan, to Sulawesi, and then the leftists in Madiun. But after that, Madiun they can crush it, but the Islamic rebellion is really hard to douse it.
I guess the Renville agreement is the signal of the end of Indonesian unity, of Republican unity in that sense. As Blimade has explained, first of all, this had pushed then the two other components within the TNI, within the fighting force of the Republic. The first the Islamist under Kartosuwiryo, and then the communists in Madiun, they would split, and so it would become the start of the civil war within the revolution. It would also result in the collapse of Amir Sharifuddin's cabinet and the rise of Muhammad Hatta. And this is also very important. Prior to Renville, the Indonesian state, the Indonesian government had no specific ideology in that sense, right? Because it was always a compromise between different factions, between Islamist and with communist and leftist, and they tried to create this sort of hybrid government, hybrid ideology. But as a result of this, the Dutch actually told the world, especially the US, that the Republican government is essentially a communist government. So Americans have always seen especially after 45, the emergence of the Republic as a leftist and a communist movement, because the Dutch told them that, and they believed that to a large extent. So that's why within the American perspective, they were trying to enforce a sort of anti-communist policy by pushing Dutch colonialism back to Indonesia, which they thought would reduce the chance of Indonesia falling into communism. So the split between the center national with the communists and the more radical Islam was actually an opportunity for the Republic to say to the Americans that we're not communist. Of course, that would then be supported by Madiun, by the Madiun affair. At the same time, during this period, Indonesia's first diplomats went to New York, and they had started developing a relationship with American government, with American society. I think one important component is that Sumitrojo Hadikusumo, who is the father of the present president Prabowo, he was part of the delegation of Indonesian diplomats posted in the UN. And he made an agreement called the Fox Agreement with someone called Matthew Fox, who is an executive at the motion picture, that Fox motion picture. And the agreement was that if Indonesia become independent, the Americans would get a lot of share for economic opportunities there. And so during the 47 to 48, but especially after 48, this notion that the Republic was communist was gone. But also, on the other hand, the Americans saw this as an opportunity to replace Dutch capitalism in Indonesia. So that's why the shift happened after Renville. It was a very important change in the revolution, but it was a win diplomatically for the center national government.
Let's turn to the left and to the PKI in particular, because as has been referenced a few times, this period culminated in a bloody, brutal defeat for the communists in September 1948, known as the Madiun Affair. In August 1948, Musso returned from the Soviet Union, and Amir, who had been prime minister from July 1947 through January 1948, he revealed that he was a member of the PKI. In that September, PKI supporters who were part of an organization called the People's Democratic Front, or FDR, launched a revolt in the Javanese city of Madiun. In response to that revolt, Republican military units, namely, once again, the Siliwangi Division, put down the revolt, made huge numbers of arrests, and executed Amir, Musso, and other PKI leaders. This is pretty dramatic. Musso is an incredibly important leader of the PKI. Amir had just been the prime minister. The left was divided over this revolt. Figures like Tan Malaka and Shahrir opposed it. Meanwhile, in December, as that conflict internal to the revolution was playing out, the Dutch launched their second so-called police action, seizing Yogyakarta, forcing the Republican military to withdraw from its capital as Sukarno and other leaders were captured. Dutch troops during this period, it's important to emphasize, committed widespread atrocities against Indonesians as the territory under control of the Republican government was besieged and rapidly shrinking. How did this communist rebellion come about, and what were its consequences for the PKI and more generally for the course of the revolution?
So Madiun is one of the most important events in Indonesian history. It shapes the trajectory of Indonesian politics afterwards until actually today. And especially it's important, and a lot of scholars have always returned back to Madiun to understand what happened in 65. The Madiun uprising has been termed in different ways. Sometimes people call it the Madiun Affair, or the Madiun Revolt, or the Madiun Provocation. It all depends on which interpretation and perspective you're taking. And then another important fact that we need to remember as a start is that Madiun at this time is the third largest city under the Republican control after Yogyakarta and Solo. Now, throughout the course of the Indonesian Revolution against the Dutch, there are splits between the communists and the socialists. One split was between nationalist communists, such as Tan Malaka, who opposed any negotiation with the Dutch, And on the other hand, the so-called Stalinists, who were more open to negotiations with the Dutch. Then there is another split between the left and the right socialists that's represented by Amir on the left and Shahrir on the right. And in 1948, the leftist socialist influence in the cabinet was greatly reduced because of the disagreement over Amir's decision to support the Renville Agreement that we just discussed. The Madiun affair, just like repeated again, so the Madiun affair occurred within the backdrop of this political crisis that's created by the Renville Agreement. The Renville Agreement, as we just talked about before, in January 48, allowed the Dutch to keep all areas within the so-called Van Mook line, right? That includes 2/3 of Java. So it's reduced, the Republicans was reduced only to 1/3 of Java. And as a consequence of this, it forced Republican troops, right, to withdraw from many areas and confined it to a much smaller territory in Java. And this resulted in economic hardship and political tensions within the revolutionary state. Now, the left-wing coalition, Sayap Kiri, which had dominated the government under Amir Sharifuddin, collapsed after he signed the agreement. Amir resigned from his position, and as we talk about, the Vice President Muhammad Hatta formed a new cabinet that's actually dominated by conservative forces, including the Islamic Party Masyumi and the nationalists, and it excluded willingly those on the left, So as a result, the left, which is both the socialists and the communists, they all lost access to state power and moved into opposition. So in response of this, the leftist organizations, including the PKI, so there are many leftist organizations. There is PKI, there is the Armed Youth Organization, there is PESINDO, the Pemuda Sosialis Indonesia, the Indonesian Socialist Youth, the Labour Party and the Stalinists in the Socialist Party. They all form the Front Demokrasi Rakyat, FDR, the People's Democratic Front, as an opposition coalition. And they tried for the next few months, they tried to secure a new cabinet with a representation. Now, as you mentioned then in your question, in August 1948, Musso, a veteran communist leader who had spent years in the Soviet Union after he went in exile, following the 1926-27 communist revolt, he returned to Indonesia. He actually returned to Indonesia also briefly in 1935, as we remember in our previous episodes, right? So Musso proposed a new revolutionary strategy for the Indonesian left, and he reorganized the PKI around a more militant line. Now, so there is Musso returning. There is this coalition between with the FDR. Now, the left also at the same time felt increasingly threatened by Hatta's government's policies. Because the government, what they did, they initiated a program called military rationalization. This military rationalization is a restructuring and downsizing of armed forces that have been hinted a little bit before by Blimade. And this program targeted many irregular militias and units that's associated with the left, including the PESINDO forces. So naturally, this created intense anxiety, right, among the left-leaning troops and militias, and they all feared disarmament, dismissal, repression. And these military tensions were particularly intense in Central and East Java, where Republican forces, militia groups, and politically affiliated units, they all competed for power. Now, conflicts between left-leaning forces, especially the PESINDO units, and regular army units intensified, right? In places like Solo and Madiun, you would see kidnapping, killing, and then clashes between the different factions of this revolutionary military. Now, this is the context of Madiun. In this context, local FDR and PESINDO leaders, they seized control of the city of Madiun on September the 18th, 1948. The revolt was actually not originally planned by the PKI leadership. It began locally, but then later it was supported by the party once the events escalated. Now, in response to that, President Sukarno, he immediately denounced the uprising, and demanded the population to choose, between, on the one hand, Soekarno-Hatta government and on the other hand, Muso's PKI. Remember, PKI didn't actually initiate it, but now it becomes the PKI, uprising. And then following this, Sukarno was speaking on radio. I don't think we have touched this before, but radio was such an important media at this point, right? At this time, from Japan until today. So Sukarno was saying this, and then as a response to this, the Republican forces moved quickly to suppress the revolt. So the Republican army actually crushed the uprising within weeks. Musso was killed while fleeing government forces. Amir Sharifuddin and other leaders were captured and executed. Actually, Amir was still wearing his pajama when he was arrested, and he was executed within months. By November, he was executed, and then thousands of PKI members and sympathizers were arrested and killed. So, what are the consequences of the Madiun affair for the PKI and the revolution? Well, one, the rebellion resulted in the death of many leaders and widespread repression of communist supporters. This is why it's often called the second, first PKI was killed in 27, now it's killed again in Madiun. This is what it means. The suppression effectively destroyed PKI as a political force for a few years. It will rise up again later in the 50s. But what's also important is that this episode created hostility between the PKI and other political forces, especially the Islamic groups such, Masyumi. And then the second consequence is that the defeat of the PKI actually consolidated authority between Sukarno, Hatta, and the Republican Army. So it allowed them to present the Republic, Abi has mentioned this, allowed them to present the Republic as anti-communist and politically stable, right? And the third consequence, as you can imagine, crushing the revolt strengthened the Republic also internationally. It is an irony because by eliminating the communist challenge, the government actually gained greater legitimacy in the emerging Cold War environment. And it improved its position in negotiations with Western powers. And this is especially true in terms of the involvement of the United States. Because here's the thing, Washington has been involved, right? I mean, since the beginning, has been initially supported the Indonesian cause because of shared anti-colonial sentiments. But after Madiun, the US began to view Indonesia through the lens of the Cold War, right, as a potential ally against the communist bloc. So it is interesting that the year 1948 began with the US fully backing the Netherlands. We just remember with the agreement, but that at the end of 48, the Renville Agreement, but at the end of 48, the US was actually warning the Netherlands not to engage in military action. And the US actually told the Dutch that, we will stop the Marshall Plan aid if you continue the military action. So when the Dutch launched a major offensive in December 48 and captured Yogyakarta, the Republic actually survived politically and militarily. And ultimately, international pressure, this is again with the US, starting to supporting Indonesia, forced the Dutch to recognize Indonesian independence in 1949 to 1950. So we must remember that even though the Republic moved closer to the United States in 1948, though, this actually did not produce a lasting alliance. So we need to remember this also, right? What is lasting and consequential from Madiun is that the event strengthened anti-communism among the military and Masyumi supporters that then deepened the left-right wing divide that shaped Indonesia's Cold War politics.
Yes, one thing I want to emphasize is that by 1948, I think the Dutch saw Indonesia differently, in a sense that so initially they wanted to retake their colony, right? But the main objectives of the Dutch was to maintain Dutch capitalism in Indonesia. The idea was that if they lost Indonesia, it would be a disaster for the Netherlands. The idea was that the Netherlands would become a Denmark without the colony. But what happened in 1948, especially after Madiun, is that the Dutch now understood that they're competing against American capitalism, and I think you can then see that during the negotiation, the roundtable negotiation, in which it was primarily focused on maintaining Dutch capitalist dominance in Indonesia in the post-war period. So they understood that the colony was not going to happen, but that they needed a way in which to ensure that Dutch capital would remain in Indonesia. Also, during the Roundtable Agreement, the Indonesians were forced to take over the debt of the Netherlands Indies. That was an amazing transgression on our sovereignty, but which Hatta agreed to. And so we've been paying for Netherlands Indies debt up until the 1990s, I think, including the debt that was incurred during the revolutionary period. So the money that was used by the Dutch to fight against Indonesians during the 40s were then forced onto us so that we pay for them. The Dutch was their approach was very economic from the start, right? So the first military action was called Operasi Product Operation Product, which is mainly to secure major installations of Dutch capitalism, primarily in the oil sector and then also in plantations. So it was always within the Dutch perspective, it was very much pushed by capitalist perspective, and it was pushed by lobby groups in the Netherlands by Dutch multinational corporations. But now they're competing against American capitalism. So Matthew Fox, the one I discussed earlier, he wasn't part of the American government, but he was a lobbyist. And I think he was very successful in lobbying Washington this idea that Indonesia was an El Dorado to be open for American capitalism. Now, he didn't succeed in developing that contract or that agreement, but I think this cemented this notion that Indonesia was this potential, this big potential, which again would animate America's interest in Indonesia for quite a long period of time afterwards.
Yeah, it put it in international context. That's what I want to just a little bit. You have to remember that in September 1949, just after the Madiun, Mao took over, or the Chinese Communist Party took over power in China. I think this is also changed the game geopolitically in Southeast Asia. We start thinking about what is exporting the revolutionary from Indonesia is already experienced that kind of period, and then now China, which is much bigger than Indonesia is, and also and neighboring countries. I think that's also changed the calculations of the American power and also the Dutch interest in Indonesia. I think that's the best that they can get, is that you pay the debt of the East Indias to us. That's the best deal they can get. But other than that, I think it's become the dynamics of Indonesian politics, inside Indonesian politics, which is same complicated as the geopolitics in the regions.
That was Rianne Subijanto, Made Supriatma, and Farabi Fakih for episode 3 of Nusantara, a series on the history of Indonesia. Rianne Subijanto is a professor of communication studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. She's the author of Communication Against Capital, Red Enlightenment at the Dawn of Indonesia, and a co-editor of The Indonesian Left in the 20th Century, Beyond the Rise and Fall of a Party. She also serves as an editor for the Indonesian left media, Indoprogress.com. Made Supriatma is a visiting research fellow at the Isaias Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore. He specializes in Indonesian politics, civil-military relations, ethnic conflict, and state bureaucracy. Farabi Fakih is the head of the master's program in the history department of Gajah Mada University in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. He's worked on the history of the decolonization of the Indonesian state and is working on a manuscript on the history of natural resource management, particularly oil and gas. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting, "The question is, can mankind fulfill its destiny without a fundamental revolution in the social state of Asia?" While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Thea Riofrancos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter, Blue Sky, Instagram at The Dig Radio, and please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this one. If it's on iTunes or Spotify, please rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really and truly does that is you telling other people to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us and do find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong.